why the title of this talk is Imperial Museums. And they sort of like build themselves a kind of architecture to convey this. So there's different kinds of museums, though even those with exclusively artistic productions are coming under decolonial critique today for the way in which their art was acquired and categorized, and also sometimes for its aesthetic content, such as unreflective portrayals of slaves in the back of bucolic family scenes, or the admiring representations of conquistadores. So as we attempt to unravel the Western world's colonial unconscious, I think we need to look at everything. But my interest is in those museums sometimes called anthropological or archaeological or natural history museums. Here's a nice example. Besides the sort of objects already mentioned, many such museums, upwards of 1,500 in the United States alone, house human remains, as well as coffins and other funerary objects buried with the dead. Started with Egypt. Sometimes they would get a sarcophagus and they would lift the mummy out, throw it to the side, and then get the sarcophagus, get the coffin, which was inlaid with a lot of hieroglyphics that were important, and cart that off. The Museum Brolic in Amsterdam estimates that half of its currently owned human remains were collected between 1750 and 1950. Just last year, Austrian museums returned 64 human remains of indigenous New Zealanders, but this return took 70 years of negotiation. As Philip Deloria recounts, Western societies engaged in grotesque practices of collecting that included trenching burial grounds, carving burial grounds, turning cemeteries into displays, and providing curiosities for P.T. Barnum's freak shows. James Clifford referred to much of 20th century anthropology and archaeology as salvage projects, where the science communities associated with the victors in a colonial struggle seek to salvage what is left of the authentic cultures of the victims. Most museums today disavow the motives and the racist ideas that were common among original collectors of human bodies, such as the idea that the cranial measurements of skulls could justify ranking human types. Yet museums still retain and display many of these items that they receive from collectors who themselves had these kinds of motives. My focus, though, is not on the ways in which the items came into the possession of museums or how they came into possession of those who sold them to museums. And I think that's an important issue. That's the issue that's getting most of the play in the press today for the last several years. It's a legitimate moral and political issue. But aside from the manner in which the items were collected, we need to understand the effects of these displays on the general public, often Western publics living in nations that promulgated colonialism. The effects are not simply the result of curatorial presentations or the explanations that are put on the wall plaques, but the decontextualization and recontextualization of objects. So to remove an object from a prior location, as this has obviously been removed, and put it on display is to recontextualize it in a way that confers new meanings. As Philip Deloria, Harvard historian and member of the Dakota people, puts it, the most important recontextualization may have centered on the authority of the museum collectors themselves, for the objects constituted them as unique figures of authority. And this is in an essay that he helped to edit of Daedalus, which is all on indigenous ways of knowing. So as Deloria argues, it's the presentation of indigenous peoples' remains were slotted into various scientific discourses. natural history, they were like animals. Ethnology and anthropology, they were earlier forms of human social organization. Archaeology, you found them when you start digging, and craniology, skull comparisons might reveal racial differences in intelligence and capacity. So there's a lot being said about these practices today. And some of the debate is instigated by museum curators, historians, and archaeologists, and some by newly empowered publics in the formerly colonized world. My focus is on the question of knowledge and the form of what I call extractivist epistemology that's at work in museum construction as well as museum defense. As Akil Mbembe says, a museum properly understood is not a dumping place. It's not a place where we recycle history's waste. It's first and foremost an epistemic space. So the questions we need to ask, I suggest, are what kind of knowledge do imperial museums impart, and what ideas about knowing do such museums impart? Archaeological museums involve a decontextualization and a recontextualization based on an initial extraction that most often involved a violation. The assumed right to take advantage of that violation is itself imparting a message about knowing, that violence is justified for knowing, that decontextualization out of its original context is actually essential to knowing, to allow for a broader perspective, a distance from insider prejudices, an assumption, a crafted neutrality. So decontextualization is presented as helpful to discern the particular meaning and meaningfulness of a given object within the larger expanse of human history. The long era of colonialism committed oppression in the sphere of knowledge. A kind of epistemicide has been called alongside genocide as a way to legitimate not only the colonial takeovers, but also ongoing colonial rule. Epistemicide has adversely affected the imaginary of the modern colonial world system, deflating and distorting global knowledge in every field of inquiry, including the sciences. And I'll give you some examples later on. So its legacy, I think, continues to influence ideas about vaccine production, for example, whether countries outside the West have sufficient scientific ability to do this. We rank cultures in the New York Times on a daily basis as traditional versus modern. And the public's attitudes toward demands for the repatriation of both objects and remains can be influenced by these characterizations. So if we can recontextualize the colonialist theories of culture, I think we'll be able to see the effects of museums today. And, you know, as an ally, the effects of museum as an ally and an alibi of colonialism, even if sometimes unwitting. The primary way museums legitimate their right of ownership and display is on the basis of protecting a cultural knowledge that has universal value that must be protected into the future. In 2002, a group of 18 major museums in the global north issued a document they called the Declaration of the Importance and Value of Universal Museums. It's fairly short, it's like one page. And it begins with a condemnation of the illegal traffic of artifacts, and they take a strong position on that. But then it argues that the current conditions of collecting do not resemble those of the past. I've highlighted a couple of passages here that I think are particularly interesting. The signatories make the interesting claim that the objects have become, here it is, have become part of the museums that have cared for them, and by extension of the heritage of the nations which house them. And this claim is surely true. But we must ask whether this heritage of colonial history is one that deserves protection. Further, the Declaration argues that the universal admiration for ancient civilizations would not be so deeply established today were it not for the influence exercised by the artifacts of these cultures, widely available to an international public. Also probably true. And further, they claim that museums serve not just the citizens of one nation, but the people of every nation. Museums are agents in the development of culture whose mission is to foster knowledge by a continuous process of reinterpretation. So this is good in terms of acknowledging the need for a continuous process of reinterpretation, right? I mean, artifacts get newly interpreted all the time. But although it makes a reference to this, there's no mention of collaboration or the need for a comprehensive correction of previous interpretations made by these museums. Rather, the Declaration appears to endorse traditional notions of expertise, housed and manifested in these museums, as if all the necessary corrections can come from within. Now, these are the 18 museums that signed that declaration in 2002. You'll see there's some really smart people who signed that declaration. The Louvre, the Met, the Whitney, the Prado, all over. Now, not everyone in the museum world agrees with this declaration, as one might imagine. George Abungu, former director of the National Museums of Kenya, voices a common view that the declaration was made by a, quote, self-appointed group of privileged museums promoting the Western world's dominance and monopoly of interpretation over other people's cultures and colonization, unquote. And some who work inside these very museums also objected, such as Dan Hicks, who's curator of the Pitts River Archaeological Museum in Oxford, who describes the argument espoused by the Declaration as a form of fascist logic. Very subtle point. Kunstschutz. By that, he means that it seizes art from inferior owners in order to keep it safe. As the philosopher and artist Ariella Aisha Azoulay argues, these disputes are often misnamed by dominant parties in ways that limit their scope and avoid the question of the role museums play in ongoing imperial legitimation. Concerning the 2002 declaration, she writes, the dispute is framed as a controversy between two claimants of a given object, but the debate about what should be done after centuries of imperial violence can't be narrowed down to this, where the object belongs. So the real controversy, Azoulay insists, is over the much broader question of the enrichment of the global north by the destruction and recontextualization of non-European cultures. Museums play a role in the enrichment of promulgating certain ideas about their collections and the peoples of the world. Who has a right to what based on their superior epistemic development? Museums legitimate certain ways of knowing that influence Western public opinion and Western subjectivities in ways that makes it possible to withstand redistribution and repatriation claims of all sorts. Dan Hicks, this is the cover of his book that I highly recommend. Very subtle there, The British Museum. He portrays the 2002 declaration as a sort of declaration of war in the ongoing ideological battle between the West and its former colonies. In his bluntly titled book, he argues that as currently configured, museums work to naturalize inequality. And to take the most famous example, the Benin Kingdom's own moral failures and cultural backwardness are presented, he shows, as somehow the cause of the event of its destruction and looting, or its precondition. This is not a very good slide, is it? The Benin bronzes, maybe some of you have seen some of the Benin. They're in museums like all over the world. They're scattered all around. They're in New York. They're in London. They're in other places. A few of them. They're pretty amazing. But what Hicks is showing is that sometimes they're seen as having been taken because of the failure of their own culture. The fact is that the military invasion that led to the looting of the Benin artifacts, here's a nice picture of that looting at the time, was motivated by England's desire to advance its trading and mining in the area, and its actions showed no concern about either human life or achieving a real understanding about the meaning and significance of the bronzes that were taken. So they're just sitting around showing their loot. There's lots of pictures like this. The question under debate today is whether the sort of anthropological and archaeological museums that came into existence during the colonial era can be sufficiently transformed to play a different role. Can they be made to play a counter-hegemonic role that could reimagine global relationships, rebuild trust, thus creating the possibility of authentic collaborations and future shared knowledge projects about human history and cultures? The key to this transformation is going to concern the methods, I want to argue, by which diverse and competing knowledge claims are adjudicated and authorized. So let's look at this concept of the universal museum. Universal museums are those that have a universal reach as claimed because they have such culturally diverse collections. But it's also meant to signify that such museums are not simply the repository of a particular cultural patrimony that reflects positively on a given group or nation. I think that's what Trump wants our museums to be, like to reflect our patrimony. But these museums don't do that, right? These big museums, they sort of provide a sense of human history. Baron Trend, the chair of the trustees of the British Museum, stated in 1983, I think I have a slide on this, that a universal museum aims to present an integrated picture of stages in the development of various civilizations of the world, and its physical integrity, that is, its right to retain its collections, comes from that kind of concept of human history. Now, I am skeptical of claims that museums can enact humanitarianism in the sphere of knowledge, but I'm not cynical about them. Surely we need to tell a complicated story about museums and museum workers, their multiple motives and effects on publics. And the idea that repatriation will solve the problem is far from the mark, as Azoulay says. We need to consider the breadth of ideas about knowledge conveyed by museum practices, what their assumptions are about how best to achieve knowledge, protect it, and also how to think about the value of knowledge itself and who has a right to it. Museums are currently playing a big role in Central America today, for example, providing funding for archaeological sites, helping to assemble the relevant experts in assessing and interpreting findings, and housing and protecting and displaying some of what can be extracted. There's really been some amazing discoveries over the last 15 years. Yet whenever U.S. organizations operate in Central America today, which is the rather benighted part of the world that I come from originally, it feels like a foreign force that has a right of entry by money and power, sometimes to gather the scraps left behind in colonial devastation, some from centuries past, some from the 1980s bombing. But today, various U.S. cultural institutions dig for cultural treasures covered over by rubble and new forest growth. And when they claim that they're engaging in universal value, it can't but sound a little hypocritical. But the story is complicated because many U.S. experts have been helpful in unearthing the mass graves of atrocities, such as in El Mozote, as well as graves created during the invasion of Panama in 1989. There's a great documentary on this called El Equipo, about this white guy in the US who's a forensic pathologist and a forensic archaeologist who trained teams all over South America and then all over many parts of the world to be able to identify people in mass graves and identify how they died for legal purposes. So it's a complicated story, but we need to trace the work of museums to the context of imperial history in order to understand how they come to have a right of entry, how they acquire objects. Today, there's only a few official colonies left, but there are many transnational relationships structured by prior wars of conquest. So the idea that museums provide universal knowledge legitimates their right to pursue knowledge. But even if this is true, does this legitimate their ability to pursue knowledge in any way they see fit? Are there limits on the pursuit of knowledge? Are those limits only moral and political, such as when we call out non-virtuous motives or significant harm that may result? Brenda Dalmia has argued that some knowledge projects should cease if they erode important relationships necessary for possible future knowledge projects. So she's offering an epistemic reason. Since current knowledge projects done badly may impede future ones by diminishing trust and a motive to collaborate. So we clearly need to address this question with a temporal sensitivity that reaches beyond the present, because you got to think about what you're doing in the present, how that's going to affect future projects. The issue of the right to know needs to be contextualized. Who is claiming this right, and in regard to what kind of knowledge? Will the knowledge reduce colonial violence or absolve it in some way? What will its effect be on the power imbalances between groups and on the possibility of sharing power? So let me just do a quick footnote on this guy, Ciriaco de Pizzicoli, otherwise known as Cyriacus of Ancona, who lived from 1391 to 1453. He plays a really key role in he's sometimes called the founder of archaeology, because he went to Constantinople, Egypt, Rhodes, Beirut, Anatolia, Damascus, Cyprus, Thessalonica, and elsewhere. He kept a daily account that got published in like 8 volumes or 7 volumes called the Commentaria, and he brought a bunch of stuff home. And he developed the theory that to know a culture's past, you need to have the objects. You can't just have the oral histories or the written histories. You got to have the objects. He sort of dismissed oral knowledge in a way that many of us are arguing against today. But he played a really important role in this idea that you have to be able to see the actual objects to understand the past of another culture. So now let's look at how this had an impact on human remains. There's been activism about returning human remains that's been pretty well organized since the 1960s in the United States. But in 1990, under increasing pressure, the US government passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA, which mandated that all human remains be treated with dignity and respect, and it made it possible for Native groups to make a claim that they could get some tribal remains back. But they had to show evidence why they believed those human remains were members of their religious or ethnic group. And so they would go to museum officials, make a claim, and then museum officials had the exclusive right to assess whether there was sufficient evidence to identify the tribal association of specific remains. So it didn't really instantiate real epistemic collaboration or evince what Dalmia calls relational epistemic humility concerning the assessment of validity. And so there's been a lot of efforts to strengthen NAGPRA, but it certainly has had a major impact. And over the last 30 years, and there's been more than 100,000. There's been tens of thousands returned, although there are still more than 100,000 housed in U.S. museums. One of the issues with NAGPRA is what counts as the remains of a living being and who determines what it means to be living. Some point to created objects such as the Ahayuda, which are wooden objects taken to be war gods or keepers of the sky that have long been traded as commodities among non-native peoples. But some argue that these objects have spiritual elements and deserve to be included as human remains in repatriation laws. If the Ahayuda are returned, the tribal practices will then place these objects outside and allow them to deteriorate. So the struggle is over ontological assumptions about how to conceptualize objects as well as how to prioritize different conceptions of values. Conflicts not easily adjudicated. In other words, you put this outside, it's going to deteriorate. It's not going to be around, at some point in the future. And some of the curators, want to tear their hair out by this. Another example, Marisol de la Cadena recounts a highly collaborative project that still demonstrated an epistemic failure. I want to look at next. This is from her book, Earth Beings. And this involved an invitation to Quechua leader Nazario Turpo to be a consultant for an exhibition planned by the United States National Museum of the American Indian, NMAI, that opened in Washington, D.C. in 2004. The NMAI brought indigenous folks from outside the U.S. to consult on the exhibits, and the translation challenges were large. For example, I just referred to Nazario Turpo as a leader. That's a misrepresentation. His community's understanding of what it means to be in Ailu, which is the term they use, is not representational but relational in ways that require some significant unpacking for outsiders to grasp. So in other words, he's not a stand-in for others in the way that we have our concept of representation, but he's in a particular relationship with other members of his community. Human remains are divided by the Quechua into two different sorts depending on the era in which they lived. Older remains are referred to as sukakuna, and their contact with living beings is today considered potentially dangerous. Turpo believed that the remains in question may have lost their power or been tamed in the intervening period by changes in material conditions or the blessings of priests. But just to be safe, when the remains were returned to Turpo's hometown of Pachanta in Peru, he and his family organized several ceremonies to reduce the danger. Oblivious to this, the NMAI officials who visited Pachanta for the return, de la Cadena writes, quote, were thrilled to witness the ceremonies, which they saw as a celebration of the repatriation of ancestors' remains. The Sukakuna as potentially dangerous entities were lost in this translation of the event. So we continental philosophers know something about translation problems. I heard some wonderful discussion yesterday on Gestell and all the many different problems with it. There's no perfect translation, right? So she follows Eduardo Viveres de Castro on the idea that mistranslations should be understood as kind of equivocations. That's the term de Castro uses. An equivocation is not an error or a failure, but, quote, a communicative disjuncture. in which interlocutors are not talking about the same thing. Disjunctures can be caused by disparate connotations or because certain ontological concepts or other ideas cannot be translated. So for the Quechua, words are not constitutively separate from the things they name. Words are substantive rather than representational. So to say Asangate, which refers in Spanish to a mountain range in the Andean region near Pachanta, is not to refer to the mountain, but to bring it into relation with oneself. And we're not unfamiliar with this idea in English since the work of J.L. Austin, but here it's applied not to specific contexts of speech that produce effects, but more widely to words that in English we would call nouns. So equivocations are unavoidable features of cultural translation, and it would be incorrect to understand them as failures. Attempting to overcome mistranslation is driven by the desire for total transparency or a neutral position, but this is both hopeless and wrong, Viveres de Castro argues. There needs to be a steady awareness of divergences of meanings within communicative practices. The attempt to purge differences will likely diminish relations, erode trust, and adversely affect what understanding is genuinely possible. So if equivocations are taken to be failures, this could motivate researchers to silence or downplay divergences. But if you see these divergences as inevitable, what does that mean epistemically? You need to maintain relationships, right? You need to maintain the ability for communicative relationships across these different groups, because no side can get a perfect mastery through total translation. So this example, I think, yields lessons about the move to a relation-based dialogic practices of knowing, but also about the challenges to creating collaborative projects. So I'll summarize these quickly and then move to the final section. The problem with museums that house human remains cannot be represented as a moral and political problem without epistemic implications. If the focus turns to developing robust relations over time, rather than securing particular outcomes that can be monetized, the possibilities for advancing greater understanding will be enhanced. So I could say more about some of these examples, but this is a representation of a despacho that Nazario created for a museum, but he couldn't do it in exactly the way that they do despachos because it involves pouring things on the floor and lighting things on fire and having smoke go out. That's what a real despacho is. So he tried to give a representation of the despacho, but after they did it, he and one of his compatriots went outside this NMAI, and they did a real despacho without anybody looking, but there was a picture taken so that they could, consecrate the space in a real way. So, two concluding sections: epistemological lessons and then museum futures. Museums are in most cases forms of extractivist projects. Sometimes they're with good intention. They are practices around knowledge and interpretation, but not developed or enacted in a vacuum. They're in institutions that have certain kinds of financial sources, oversight, and attachment to tourism agendas, reliance on existing academic resources, and academic squabbles. And today, an increasingly volatile political scrutiny that's regularly threatening to withdraw government funding if they're perceived as pursuing, the wrong kind of agenda. Yet museums must still move forward by taking into account the truth about their collections and the truth about the practices needed for interpretation and understanding across such cultural differences. The recent decision to return the Benin bronzes to Nigeria was recently revoked that, so they decided to return some of the Benin bronzes, but then they were very upset because they found out that the Nigerian government was not necessarily going to place the Benin bronzes in a museum, but going to return them to the royal family who had owned them. And so the Western officials were very upset about this. Some European museums now want to rescind their plans of return, calling this a disaster on the grounds, once again, that these are world treasures whose knowledge is rightfully owned by the world. But they're still sitting in judgment. They're still positioning themselves as the authority to decide what is going to be done with them. This is a picture of a Nigerian artist, Osaru Abaseki, who's working on a painting using the ashes from where the Benin bronzes were originally made. She herself has never seen a Benin bronze in person. She goes to the foundries where the Benin bronzes were made, takes the ashes, and makes her art. And another artist from Benin City, Onoti Ogbebor, says that the artifacts were made to tell stories, to keep memories, and to hand over all these stories and memories from one generation to another. Museums in the global north have recontextualized stolen artifacts into objects of admiration, she says, when in truth they were objects holding information. Maybe I have this on here. No, not yet. So the same could be said of the quipus of the Inca, as well as wampum belts used by many North American indigenous groups to record treaties and covenants. Stolen objects are continuously misnamed, poorly understood, resulting in the waste of the knowledge that they do contain, or being yoked to the knowledge projects of colonizers. The truth is that practices of extracting cultural artifacts and holding them in museums has in some cases augmented the world's knowledge, but has also diminished it, as well as diminishing the ability of some groups to know their own history. So, concluding lessons, museum material objects require interpretation. For discernment of meaning, interpretation requires contextualization and collaboration. Collaboration with cultural insiders requires trust. Decontextualization subtracts knowledge. Recontextualization adds knowledge. There's no transfer of knowledge without epistemic effects. So I'm just trying to think through like the knowledge claims piece of it. I mean, this is a big issue, and I'm just trying to focus on this one piece, the claim of knowledge by these museums outside of collaboration or recontextualization. So, and I think that this is a species of extractivist epistemology that was developed at a certain point in time, coincident with the development of European colonialism. So last section, museum futures, the conclusion. I'll give you 3 options. You can vote. What should we do? This is a lively debate going on, and we can expect this to continue for some time. It's not going to end anytime soon. There's 3 options I'll give you. This I do it. Azulay says strike. She calls on museum workers to go on strike, to cease and desist their work, to call out the project of universal knowledge as a sham, to refuse to continue to lend their expertise to imperial projects, and to support the deaccession of all the loot. But she implies a timeline to the strike and a future day when we might do things differently, in which others could engage again in rebuilding their world with the material capital stolen from them. So that's one option. Dan Hicks wants us, first of all, to cease and desist all mythic storytelling about Western collections, their history, their function in the world. He calls this refusing to defend the indefensible. If museums are weapons, we need to hammer them into plowshares. And I think there are some examples of that. The Tropen Museum in Amsterdam is a lovely example of this. Hicks also calls for total restitution until no Western museum has a single artifact that does not belong there. This is necessary to change the relationships for knowledge making in the future. Museums can then be engaged in new, creative, and collaborative endeavors. Those are the first two. The third one comes from Deloria. He's also been intimately involved in museums and helping to create the National Museum of the American Indian in particular that I discussed. And he has a positive sense that this museum, although it has some problems, like the use of the word Indian in its title, when all the South Americans came, they said, "Why are you using the word Indian?" You can't actually, that term doesn't get used in other parts of the Americas. But he thinks that this museum has made some important advances. When I visited it, I was struck by the focus on the present. Here were indigenous communities thriving and surviving. Here were their current forms of cultural expression and community building. The people who made this museum want visitors to know they're still around, working collectively to establish Buen Vivir. So Deloria describes the museum in this way. He says, the NMAI is a disorienting museum. It gleefully decontextualized ethnographic artifacts, assembling arrowheads, ceramic masks, and small gold pieces into new forms, puncturing viewers' efforts to find a linear argument as they moved through a gallery. So if you remember Baron Tweed's idea that we have to have these imperial museums to be able to tell the story of human history, that macro meta story, that's what he's referring to here. Not. Many visitors wanted a recounting of a painful history around which they could organize viewing experiences of guilt, empathy, and painless redemption before heading to the cafe for quasi-exotic food. The museum studiously avoided the tone of dispassionate anthropological expertise found on so many wall labels in other museums. In other words, it seemed to have willfully walked away from the capital M authority of the museum itself. Visitors' confusion was the result of an assertive indigenous museum practice, non-linear and holistic, that doubled down on the absence of the forms and language of the classic Western museum. So those are three options. There's probably more, but that's where I'll end. These are some images from Deloria's book and some images from the NMAI Museum. Thank you very much.